Hey Instagram, Marin from indiebirth here, continuing our series about myths of independent midwifery. So we've had a couple videos and lives over the last few days. I believe Margot did a live yesterday, although I don't think it was posted anywhere, so you may have missed that one for good. But today's myth is that independent midwives have no boundaries and are just reckless. And so I could be funny about it for a minute, just in the spirit of good humor and making light of things. But I think it's easy to paint the picture of the independent midwife from whatever other perspective as just being crazy, the one that takes on the, two-headed triplets or whatever, the person who's had 10 cesareans or whatever, like put in something that feels kind of out there to you. And someone has maybe said that. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that because, yes, on one hand, it's sort of comical. On the other hand, I don't know what other people's boundaries are, so I can't really speak to that, but I can share more about my own boundaries and how I approach that, because in the 10 plus years of practice on my own, I am continually reminded, and I'm not saying this is good or bad necessarily, but I'm continually reminded that I actually fall into the conservative category. And I think that's shocking. So why is that shocking? I think it's because the world of midwifery at large, so more medicalized midwifery, with rules and regulations, which most states have around midwives, defines their practice. So the midwives don't have to think about, and again, this isn't always a bad thing. Like, they don't have to personally consider, they don't have to intellectually consider some of the boundaries, right? So there are things they're just not allowed to do. If the waters have been open for X number of hours is a great example. It's easier, perhaps, for them to say to a woman, I can't, I just can't. That's outside of my scope of practice. And I have total respect for that. I think we each choose the boundaries, whether we set them or we accept preset boundaries, and we stick to them, because there's nothing more confusing for women than having no boundaries. And that's I could go down a rabbit hole about that with licensed midwifery, because I think many of us know there's a good handful of licensed midwives not respecting the rules and regulations that they're supposed to follow. And then it's really confusing for women, because the box they thought they were in suddenly becomes like this amorphous box. And that can be really not only confusing, but really disconcerting for women that, for whatever reason, feel safety of being in that box. So again, no judgment on that at all. But having boundaries, just personal, professional boundaries, has to happen, whether or not you have rules and regs above your head or not. And honestly, it's one of the most beautiful things of being an independent midwife, being able to think for myself. And actually, sometimes, I won't lie, it's really freaking hard, because it's not someone telling me I have to do something. It's easy to pass the buck in that way, right? Or it can be. I'm not saying it always is. Sometimes it's really hard, no matter what the situation, to tell a woman that you don't feel you're the best person for her anymore. But of course, when that comes from something above you, again, the rules and regs, you can just clearly say, hey, it's outlined here in the rules, in the statute, I can't do that. Okay, usually a done deal. But for me, it's not that way. But it doesn't mean I don't have boundaries. And I think this is the silliest myth, but yet it's one that serves medicalized midwifery, because it's really easy to then say, oh, that person is reckless because she doesn't have rules and regs to follow. Think about how insulting that is to just women. We're not capable of thinking for ourselves. We're not capable of setting good boundaries, being reasonable, even having quote unquote protocol, unless the man tells us what it is, right? So it's just insulting to women for, again, licensed midwifery at large. It's not necessarily a personal thing, but that system to frown upon the lack of, rules around independent midwifery, when they don't recognize we actually have to come up with that stuff for ourselves, which is way harder. it's such the classic, like, blurring of areas for me, because on one hand, women that I serve are so completely unique and different that it is hard to have many super black and white rules like around my practice. Because again, women are so different. And I'm not just considering like their physical state, but I'm getting to know them, hopefully, and I'm considering what I know about them emotionally and spiritually and intuitively. And I'm not saying that from a place of judgment. It's discernment. It's discernment, not judgment, to realize what you can handle and what you should be involved in as a midwife. It's actually not really a commentary on the woman or her situation. If I decide not to work with someone, it's outside of what I feel comfortable with. It doesn't mean that I don't, I think her birth will be bad or anything like that. It just means it's not the person for me for all the reasons that I mentioned. And so it's so much more complex than a set of physical criteria. So to give you some examples, sometimes it does look like physical criteria from the outside, but there's so much more that goes into it. So, something like waters being open at term, and I'll talk about preterm in a minute, but waters being open at term prior to labor is a classic example of needing to find my way through. I don't have set rules on that because it's going to depend on the woman. It's going to depend on her baby. It's going to depend on her health. It's going to depend on what she's been through before, what she's willing to look at emotionally, how she's willing to go forward, addressing her fears, blah, blah, blah. So maybe for some women, it's something you start to not feel comfortable with after 24 hours. But I don't have that set number of hours like the rules and regs of many licensed midwives, because that's ridiculous to me. It's not treating a person like a person. And the truth is, like, many healthy women will have their waters open prior to labor and they're fine. So, how can we make that blanket statement? I can't. I don't want to. And I really enjoy working with people individually and hearing where they're coming from. And again, taking the whole person into account. So that, I feel like, definitely addresses that myth that independent midwives have no boundaries. I definitely do, but sometimes it's a more fluid boundary and it takes creativity. It doesn't mean I don't have one. It just means I have to think and I have to feel into it. Then I actually have to work with someone. So it's really dismissive to have this myth that we don't know what we're doing and we just do whatever presents itself. But it's an easy enough one to put out there because it's really a contrast between being told what to do by a piece of paper, which I'm so glad I don't have to work that way. So an example of a more set boundary for me would be like a preterm situation. I'm not comfortable with a 33, 34 week baby at home. I'm just not. And I don't know what it would take for me to be. I don't know that I ever would be, because I think there are just some things that make sense about physiology and the way babies grow and all of that. Obviously, there's always more to that conversation, though. Maybe it's even like just making sure the dates are really solid before you get all crazy about, transferring someone to the hospital. No one wants to do that lightly. But I definitely have boundaries. And I don't like the idea of really tiny babies being born at home that might need more assistance than we're able to provide. I think that's just common sense. But again, it's a conversation with a woman and risks and benefits and being really transparent about my own boundaries and comfort level. That's different than just, can't work with you anymore, bye, And not to say that that's what midwives are out there doing. I'm sure many licensed midwives are having really compassionate conversations and, explaining. But boundaries are good. We can't be criticizing people, even doctors. I honor doctors in their own right for having their boundaries, around breech birth is a great example. Like, just be honest about it. If you don't know how to facilitate a vaginal breech birth, I want to hear that. If I was a mom and I was in the hospital, I'd want to hear that. I don't necessarily want someone trying to deliver a breech baby when they know nothing. Like, that's kind of dangerous. So we need to respect people and their boundaries. And the myth that independent midwives don't have any, of course, is just insane. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say about that. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Yeah, I guess other things too, that don't come back to like necessarily rules and regulations around stuff, but this perception again that if you're not licensed, you're doing crazy, wacky things, again, for me, is just not true. Like, knock on wood, I'm going to knock on some sort of wood here with my foot. In 10 years of practice, I have never broken anybody's water artificially. Like, never done that for my own convenience. In theory, I could see that it would be useful if a baby really needed to get out. But I would never do that for my own convenience or to push things along or to get to another birth, right? And I hear stories day after day. Email, we do virtual prenatals with midwives that are under rules and regs. So guess what they do often? Again, this isn't like a always. Often they do something like artificially break the bag of waters because they're under a time crunch, right? So let's just call it all what it is. Transparency is important. Having your own boundaries, super important. Personal and professional boundaries. Being honest about your skills, about your training, about what you're willing to do, what you're not willing to do. And recognizing that the current state of midwifery has made it look like there's a good midwife and there's a bad midwife. And again, not always. Like, I know a lot of people watching don't necessarily feel that way, but I'm just saying in sort of mainstream culture, if we get into the nitty gritty, people think it's preferable, it's safer to hire the licensed midwife. They think she must be more trained, she must be smarter, when in reality, none of that is necessarily true. Hey, and that's a myth for another day. But again, back to the myth of the fact that independent midwives don't have any rules to follow internally. They don't have any boundaries. And therefore, you're just going to have this like freewheel in birth where you're just crossing your fingers and hoping everything works out. So that is my myth for today. Going off to celebrate my daughter's 17th birthday today with her. We're going to do some shopping and have lunch and just enjoy the fact that she's turning 17. So thanks for watching. If you have comments, or questions, we're going to continue this series for a couple more days. So be sure to message us or comment here. And if there are other things you'd like to hear us talk about around these myths, we'd love to do that. And yeah, ultimately, we are accepting applications for Indiebirth Midwifery School right now until December 10th. There are also several scholarships available, creative scholarships, and women of color scholarships. So if what you've heard today is interesting to you, you get what I'm saying, then head on over to indiebirthmidwiferyschool.org and apply. Have a great day.